Imagine for a moment that you stand in a room filled with people, all gazing at the same painting on the wall. Most describe the bright colors, the familiar shapes, the obvious details. But you, for some reason, notice something hidden in the background, a shadowy figure almost invisible to the untrained eye. You point it out, and suddenly the atmosphere changes. Some are intrigued, others uncomfortable, and a few refuse to believe it exists at all. This is the very essence of what Carl Jung spoke about when he warned of the danger of seeing what others do not. To perceive beyond the surface, to recognize truths buried deep in the collective unconscious, is both a gift and a burden. It sets one apart, often misunderstood, sometimes even rejected, yet it is through this deeper vision that transformation is born. In today's lecture, we will explore why seeing what others cannot is not only a path toward greater awareness, but also a path strewn with profound challenges that test the soul, the psyche, and the courage to remain authentic when the world demands conformity. When Jung spoke about the burden of perception, he was pointing toward the peculiar and often painful reality of being able to see beneath the veil of ordinary appearances. Most people live within a consensus reality, a kind of shared agreement of what is seen, understood, and accepted. This consensus is not always accurate, nor is it complete, but it creates a sense of safety and belonging. To step outside of it, to notice layers of truth that others either cannot or will not acknowledge, is to step into a kind of exile. The individual who perceives more deeply finds that their insights cannot always be communicated in a way that others will accept, and so their vision, instead of being celebrated, often becomes a source of isolation. Jung understood this well, for in his own exploration of the psyche he unearthed truths about archetypes, the collective unconscious, and the shadow self that unsettled both his contemporaries and those who preferred the comfort of surface thinking. The burden of perception begins with the inner experience itself. When someone notices what others overlook, it generates both wonder and weight. There is the wonder of insight, the sudden awareness of a hidden pattern, the recognition of meaning in what seemed meaningless. But this very recognition separates the one who sees from the crowd. The awareness that others remain blind to forces. A dilemma: does one remain silent to preserve belonging, or speak and risk rejection? This tension is the essence of the burden. Silence protects the self from ridicule, but it also creates an inner dissonance, because to suppress insight is to betray authenticity. Speaking, on the other hand, risks alienation, misunderstanding, even hostility. Thus, to carry perception is to live in a world of double binds, where every choice has both cost and consequence. Jung often emphasized that the unconscious, when made conscious, demands responsibility. To see something that others do not is not merely to have an intellectual insight, it is to carry a moral responsibility to integrate and embody that vision. Yet this responsibility is not simple. It requires discernment, humility, and courage. For the visionary is always walking a line between truth and madness in the eyes of society. Consider the mystics, the prophets, the thinkers, who brought forth new paradigms. Almost all endured periods of loneliness, suspicion, or outright persecution. Their perception placed them outside the safe boundaries of the collective, and their burden was not just what they saw, but the consequences of being the one who saw. On a psychological level, the burden of perception can create a feeling of alienation. Imagine a person who has experienced a profound inner realization about the hidden motives behind human behavior. They begin to notice the masks people wear, the projections at play in conversations, the unconscious drives shaping decisions. To them, these truths are glaring, impossible to ignore. Yet to others, they are invisible, and attempts to point them out may be met with denial or anger. The one who sees is caught between the clarity of their vision and the resistance of those who prefer ignorance. This produces a sense of distance, as if one is living in a parallel world. The isolation is not only social but existential, for the visionary feels the weight of carrying a truth that has no immediate audience willing to hear it. Jung also suggested that society, in its need for stability, often resists those who disturb its illusions. To see what others do not is, in some way, to disturb their sense of order. People cling to familiar interpretations because they provide predictability. When someone introduces a deeper or darker truth, it unsettles that predictability and threatens the fragile scaffolding of meaning. This is why truth-tellers and visionaries are often scapegoated or silenced. Their perception is not celebrated as a gift, but feared as a disruption. And so the burden is not only in holding the perception itself, but in enduring the consequences of society's defensive response. Yet, Within this burden lies a paradox. While perception isolates, it also deepens the individual's relationship with their own soul. The one who sees is forced to turn inward, to cultivate a rich inner life that compensates for the lack of outer validation. This inner depth becomes a kind of sanctuary, a place where vision is not only tolerated but nurtured. Jung described this as the individuation process, the journey toward becoming one's true self. To individuate is to differentiate from the collective, to honor one's own inner truth even when it diverges from the consensus. The burden of perception, then, is also the seed of individuation. It compels the individual to rely less on external affirmation and more on inner alignment with the self. The archetype of wholeness within the psyche. The experience of carrying this burden also teaches humility. To see what others do not is not to be superior, but to be entrusted with a vision that is not entirely one's own. Jung was clear that much of what we perceive arises from the unconscious, which is not under the ego's control. Thus, perception is as much a gift as it is a responsibility. The individual who sees must avoid the temptation of arrogance, the belief that because they see more, they are greater than those who do not. True perception requires recognizing that vision comes from beyond the personal ego and carries obligations toward wisdom, compassion, and patience. Without humility, perception becomes a weapon of division rather than a path of integration. Another aspect of the burden of perception is the challenge of communication. Even when one wishes to share their vision, language often fails. The deepest truths, those that reach into the archetypal layers of the psyche, resist easy articulation. They are experienced symbolically, through images, dreams, and myths. To translate such experiences into everyday language is like trying to capture the depth of the ocean in a glass of water. Misunderstandings are inevitable. People may misinterpret, trivialize, or distort the vision. This failure of communication adds another layer to the burden, leaving the visionary feeling not only isolated but frustrated, trapped between the richness of inner awareness and the poverty of outer expression. Consider, too, the emotional weight that perception carries. To see what others do not often means confronting realities that are painful or unsettling. For example, to recognize the shadow, the repressed, denied aspects of the self and society is to perceive the darkness that most prefer to avoid. This confrontation with shadow material can be overwhelming. It exposes the cruelty, hypocrisy, and violence lurking beneath the surface of human life. Carrying this awareness without becoming bitter or despairing requires immense psychological strength. The danger is that the visionary, overwhelmed by what they see, withdraws into cynicism or collapses under the pressure of hopelessness. The burden of perception thus includes the struggle to maintain balance, to hold both light and shadow without being destroyed by either. There is also the relational impact of perception. Friendships, family ties, and professional connections may all be strained by the gap between what the visionary sees and what others accept. The one who perceives may be accused of overthinking, imagining things, or being too intense. They may be dismissed or marginalized, and in some cases, their relationships fracture entirely. Yet within this challenge lies an opportunity. By learning to navigate these relational difficulties, the visionary develops discernment in choosing companions who can tolerate, if not fully share, their depth. They may find a smaller but more authentic circle of relationships, grounded in mutual respect for individuality and truth. This refined circle becomes a source of strength, a reminder that while perception isolates, it also connects those rare few who share similar vision. At its deepest level, the burden of perception is a confrontation with the mystery of existence itself. To see what others do not is to stand at the edge of the unknown, to glimpse the archetypal forces shaping human life, and to sense the vastness of the unconscious that stretches beyond the individual psyche. Such perception brings awe, reverence, and at times terror. The visionary is reminded of their own smallness in the face of the numinous, the divine, the infinite. This awareness humbles and enlarges the soul, anchoring the individual not in the approval of society but in the deeper rhythm of life itself. When Carl Jung described the collective unconscious and contrasted it with individual awareness, he was illuminating one of the deepest psychological tensions that a human being can experience. On one hand, there is the powerful pull of the collective psyche, the inherited patterns of thought, behavior, and perception that bind us into a shared human experience. On the other hand, there is the call of individuality, the unique awareness and insight that sets a person apart, allowing them to see truths that may be invisible to the majority. This tension is not a minor inconvenience. It is one of the great struggles of human development. To live authentically is to navigate between the need to belong and the demand to remain true to one's inner vision, even when it clashes with the collective. Jung insisted that every individual must come to terms with this tension if they wish to individuate, to become whole, and yet he acknowledged that the process is fraught with conflict and challenge. The collective unconscious is not simply a repository of forgotten memories or cultural habits. It is the deep reservoir of archetypes, the primordial images and symbols that shape the myths, religions, and patterns of human life across cultures and ages. It is the reason why creation myths from distant parts of the globe bear striking similarities, why dreams are populated by figures that transcend personal experience, and why human beings respond instinctively to symbols of the hero, the mother, the shadow, and the trickster. The collective unconscious exerts a tremendous gravitational pull, drawing the individual into the safety of conformity, shared meaning, and social acceptance. To step outside of this gravitational field is to risk loneliness and estrangement, for the collective unconscious represents not only inner structures of the psyche but also the outward manifestation of cultural norms, traditions, and expectations. Against this backdrop, individual awareness emerges as a disruptive force. When a person becomes conscious of truths that the collective unconscious keeps veiled, they are compelled to differentiate themselves from the group. They may notice hypocrisies in cultural traditions, recognize unconscious drives that shape social behavior, or sense archetypal dynamics playing out in real life while others remain blind to them. This heightened awareness can feel like a liberation, but it also creates friction. The collective resists those who threaten its cohesion, and individuals who voice uncomfortable truths are often marginalized, ridiculed, or condemned. Thus, the individual faces the painful reality of choosing between belonging and authenticity, between silence and truth. The tension between conformity and truth is evident throughout history. Great thinkers, mystics, and reformers often stood at odds with the societies they lived in. Their insights into human nature or divine reality clashed with prevailing norms, and they paid the price of alienation. Yet their courage to remain loyal to their vision ultimately transformed the collective itself. Jung saw this dynamic at play not only in the lives of historical figures but in the inner lives of ordinary people. Every individual who begins to question the unconscious assumptions of their family, community, or culture enters into the same conflict. They awaken to truths that others resist, and in doing so, they risk the comfort of conformity. From a psychological perspective, the collective unconscious provides security because it relieves the individual of the burden of thinking independently. To conform is to be shielded by the group's shared worldview. The rituals, myths, and collective stories provide meaning and order, sparing the individual from the chaos of having to invent meaning alone. Yet this safety comes at a cost: the suppression of individuality, the stifling of unique insights, and the silencing of those inner promptings that lead toward growth. The individual who awakens to these inner promptings often feels torn. They recognize the truth of their own perception, but they also feel the ache of being separated from the group's protective embrace. This ache can manifest as guilt, fear, or even shame, for to resist the collective is to break the unspoken contract of belonging. Jung believed that individuation requires confronting this tension directly. To individuate is not to reject the collective unconscious entirely, nor is it to surrender to it completely. Rather, it is to stand consciously between the two, honoring the archetypal patterns that shape human existence while remaining faithful to one's unique awareness. This balancing act demands courage. The collective unconscious will always exert pressure to conform, and the individual must continually choose to align with truth even when it means enduring misunderstanding. This is why Jung emphasized the heroic dimension of individuation. To become oneself is to walk a path similar to that of the mythic hero, who departs from the familiar, confronts challenges, and returns transformed. The hero's journey is, in psychological terms, the journey of individuating against the gravitational pull of the collective. This tension is visible in the realm of morality and ethics as well. Collective norms often define what is considered right and wrong, acceptable and unacceptable. Yet individual awareness sometimes reveals that these norms are flawed, hypocritical, or destructive. For example, collective systems may perpetuate injustice or repress aspects of human experience that are vital to wholeness. The individual who perceives this must decide whether to remain complicit in the collective's illusions or to challenge them. Such challenges are rarely welcomed. They destabilize the collective's sense of security, exposing its unconscious shadow. The one who raises uncomfortable truths is often branded as a troublemaker or rebel, when in fact they are responding to a deeper awareness of truth. The price of this awareness is the loneliness of standing outside the safety of consensus. The interplay between collective unconscious and individual awareness also manifests in the inner life of the psyche. Within each person, the collective unconscious expresses itself through dreams, symbols, and instincts. When these forces remain unconscious, they operate automatically, guiding behavior without reflection. Individual awareness, however, shines a light on these forces, bringing them into consciousness where they can be examined and integrated. This process is disruptive because it challenges the ego's established identity, which is often aligned with collective norms. To recognize, for example, the presence of the shadow within oneself is to admit that one carries darkness that society condemns. To acknowledge archetypal forces is to realize that one's behavior is not entirely rational or self-directed, but influenced by deeper currents. These realizations can be destabilizing, but they also open the path toward greater authenticity. Emphasis on symbols illustrates how this tension operates. Symbols arise from the collective unconscious, carrying layers of meaning that resonate across cultures, yet each individual must interpret these symbols in light of their own awareness and experience. A dream of a serpent, for instance, may carry archetypal significance, but its meaning for the dreamer depends on their personal context. The symbol bridges the collective and the individual, reminding us that the two realms are not separate but interwoven. The challenge lies in not reducing the symbol to mere collective interpretation or dismissing it as irrelevant, but allowing individual awareness to engage with it in a living and transformative way. The collective unconscious expresses itself through projections, where individuals or groups attribute their own unconscious content onto others. Societies project their shadows onto outsiders, enemies, or scapegoats. Individuals project their own inner conflicts onto partners, colleagues, or public figures. To live unconsciously is to remain trapped in these projections, mistaking them for reality. Individual awareness, however, recognizes the projection for what it is and withdraws it, reclaiming responsibility for what belongs to the self. This act of withdrawing projection is often resisted by the collective, which depends on scapegoating to maintain cohesion. Yet it is essential for individuation, for only by withdrawing projections can one begin to see both oneself and others. Clearly, the conflict between collective unconscious and individual awareness also has a spiritual dimension. Collective religion, with its rituals, dogmas, and institutions, provides meaning for millions by drawing from the archetypes of the collective unconscious, yet individual spiritual experience often transcends or even contradicts collective forms. Mystics throughout history have described visions, revelations, or experiences of the divine that place them at odds with institutional religion. Their awareness could not be confined to collective dogma. Jung admired such figures because they exemplified the courage to remain loyal to their experience of truth even in the face of institutional opposition. This courage to honor the individual experience of the numinous is a hallmark of individuation and a profound example of the tension between conformity and truth. Living within this tension requires an acceptance of paradox. The collective unconscious provides the soil from which individuality emerges, yet to individuate one must differentiate from it. The individual cannot reject the collective entirely, for it contains the archetypal wisdom of humanity, but neither can they surrender to it without losing their soul. Jung's insight was that the goal is not to escape the tension but to inhabit it consciously. To do so is to live a life of depth, where one honors both the shared structures of human existence and the unique call of one's own inner awareness. The shadow of rejection is one of the most profound realities that emerges when a person dares to see and speak truths that others are unwilling to acknowledge. Carl Jung understood deeply that the psyche carries not only light but also darkness, not only conscious awareness but unconscious repression. And when someone perceives what the collective resists, they often become a mirror that others would rather shatter than gaze into. To see more deeply is already to carry a burden, but to attempt to share this perception often provokes rejection, misunderstanding, and even hostility. The rejection is not only personal, it is archetypal. It arises from the defensive mechanisms of both individuals and groups who protect themselves from truths that might unravel their established worldview. In this sense, the visionary, the seer, or the truth-teller is often cast out, not because they are wrong, but precisely because they are right in ways that others are not ready to accept. Rejection comes in many forms. Sometimes it is subtler, silence after words are spoken, a glance that dismisses, a smile that conceals discomfort. At other times it is direct and harsh criticism, ridicule, or outright hostility. For the one who sees, these responses can be confusing and painful. They may ask themselves whether they have misperceived, whether their insight was flawed, or whether they have overstepped some invisible boundary. Jung emphasized that the unconscious resists exposure. It defends itself through denial, projection, and repression. Thus, when someone points out what lies hidden, they often become the target of these very defenses. The group projects its discomfort onto the one who speaks, labeling them as strange, dangerous, or deluded. The shadow of rejection falls upon the seer, even though the darkness originates in those who refuse to see. The experience of rejection is not only external but internal. The individual who perceives more than others often struggles with feeling torn between the clarity of their vision and the pain of being cast aside. This inner conflict can become a tormenting cycle. On one hand, the vision feels undeniable, as if it carries the authority of something beyond the personal ego. On the other hand, the lack of external validation gnaws at the psyche, tempting the individual to silence themselves, to conform, to bury what they know in exchange for belonging. This inner tug-of-war mirrors the external tension between the collective unconscious and individual awareness, and it becomes one of the defining struggles of individuation. To withstand rejection without collapsing into despair or surrendering to conformity requires extraordinary resilience. History provides countless examples of this dynamic. The prophets of ancient times, who spoke against the corruption of their societies, were often reviled, ignored, or persecuted. Philosophers and scientists who challenged established dogmas faced ridicule and exile. Mystics who reported visions beyond the sanctioned doctrines of their religions were branded heretics. In each case, the rejection they endured was not simply personal prejudice but the collective defending itself against truths too disruptive to integrate. Jung recognized in these figures the archetype of the rejected prophet or the wounded healer, those whose gift of sight condemned them to loneliness but also connected them to deeper dimensions of the human psyche. The rejection they endured became part of their transformation, for it forced them to rely on inner strength rather than external approval. Psychologically, rejection is tied to projection. When a person or group cannot face an uncomfortable truth within themselves, they project it onto another. The one who perceives becomes the scapegoat, carrying the burden of what others disown. Jung described the scapegoat mechanism as a way for societies to externalize their shadows, casting their denied impulses onto an individual or minority group. The visionary, by daring to reveal what is hidden, becomes an ideal target for this projection. Their clarity is distorted into madness, their courage into arrogance, their authenticity into rebellion. In this way, rejection serves as a defense mechanism for the collective, preserving its fragile sense of stability at the expense of the individual who dares to disturb it. For the one who perceives, the shadow of rejection can become a crucible. It strips away illusions about belonging, forcing them to confront the reality of solitude. Yet within this solitude lies the possibility of transformation. By enduring rejection, the visionary is pushed inward, toward deeper engagement with their own psyche. They are compelled to confront their own shadow, to distinguish between genuine vision and ego-driven inflation, to purify their perception through the fire of isolation. Jung often emphasized that the individuation process is not comfortable. It is a path of trial and testing, and rejection is one of its unavoidable teachers. The pain of being misunderstood forces the individual to clarify their truth, to refine their awareness, and to find strength in alignment with the self rather than the approval of others. The shadow of rejection also shapes how the visionary relates to others. Experiencing misunderstanding and hostility can foster bitterness, mistrust, or superiority if one is not careful. There is a temptation to see oneself as fundamentally different, even above others, as a way of compensating for the pain of exclusion. Jung warned against this inflation, for it leads to isolation that is not creative but destructive. True individuation requires remaining connected to humanity even when one stands apart from it. The challenge is to hold both the uniqueness of one's vision and the humility of recognizing that all humans share in the unconscious patterns of the psyche. Rejection, then, becomes an invitation to cultivate compassion, to see in others not merely blindness or hostility but the deep fear that accompanies the confrontation with truth. Rejection can also serve as a mirror for the visionary. Not all rejection is unjustified, and not all perception is pure. Sometimes what feels like vision may be colored by personal wounds, projections, or distortions. The resistance of others can therefore become a test, forcing the individual to examine whether their insight is truly grounded in depth or inflated by ego. In this sense, rejection is a refining force, stripping away illusions and sharpening discernment. It demands that the visionary return again and again to the source of their perception, checking whether it arises from genuine engagement with the unconscious or from personal complexes seeking expression. This process, though painful, strengthens the authenticity of the vision and anchors it more deeply in truth. Jung also saw the archetypal dimension of rejection in myths and stories. The hero is often rejected at the beginning of their journey, cast out from the community, misunderstood by their peers. This exile is not an accident, but a necessary step in the process of transformation. Only by leaving the comfort of the collective can the hero descend into the depths, encounter the shadow, and return with new wisdom. Rejection, in this archetypal sense, is the threshold to initiation. The pain of being excluded becomes the doorway to deeper connection with the self and, ultimately, to a greater contribution to the collective once transformation has occurred. The visionary's rejection is thus both a wound and a preparation, shaping them for the role they are called to play. At a social level, the shadow of rejection reveals how fragile collective agreements truly are. What holds groups together is not always truth, but the illusion of truth. And when someone challenges that illusion, they threaten the group's cohesion. Rejection is the collective's attempt to preserve its stability, even if it means silencing the one who sees more clearly. This dynamic explains why societies often persecute their visionaries in life, only to celebrate them after death. Once their ideas have been integrated and no longer pose an immediate threat, the rejection of the present becomes the acceptance of the future, but the visionary must endure the pain of standing in the gap between these two times. Jung understood this as the tragedy and the necessity of individuation. One must bear the burden of being ahead of one's time. For the individual who experiences rejection, the psychological challenge is to avoid collapsing into despair. The pain of being misunderstood can lead to withdrawal, depression, or even self-destruction. Yet if they can hold the tension, if they can endure the loneliness without extinguishing their inner light, rejection becomes a source of strength. It teaches resilience, self-reliance, and a deeper trust in the reality of the unconscious. It pushes the individual toward inner integration, toward building a relationship with the self that cannot be shaken by the opinions of others. This inner grounding allows the visionary to continue their journey, not in arrogance, but in quiet strength, carrying the truth they have seen even when others refuse to acknowledge it. The shadow of rejection also reveals something about the collective itself. When a society rejects its visionaries, it exposes its own fear and resistance. It reveals the areas where growth is most needed, the truths most desperately avoided. In this way, rejection is diagnostic. It shows where the collective is blind, where it clings to illusions, where it refuses to confront its shadow. The visionary, by enduring rejection, becomes a living symbol of the truths the collective must one day face. Their very existence is a challenge, a reminder, a seed planted in the soil of the collective psyche that may only bear fruit long after they are gone. Transformation, through courage, is one of the central themes in Carl Jung's work, for he understood that the journey of individuation is not merely an intellectual exercise, but a profound confrontation with the forces of the unconscious, the pressures of the collective, and the fears that dwell within the human heart. To see what others do not see, to carry perception that unsettles the consensus, requires more than insight. It requires the courage to remain authentic in the face of opposition, misunderstanding, and solitude. Without courage, the individual collapses back into conformity, silencing the voice of their inner truth in exchange for the safety of belonging. With courage, however, transformation becomes possible, for it is only by remaining faithful to one's authentic vision that the psyche can grow into its fullness. Courage, in Jung's framework, is not reckless defiance, but the steady alignment of the individual with the deeper currents of the self, even when doing so comes at great cost. The process of individuation is by its nature disruptive, for it calls a person away from the comfort of collective norms and into the uncharted territory of their own psyche. The collective pressures, conformity through expectations, traditions, and unconscious assumptions, and stepping away from these pressures often triggers resistance, both from others and from within oneself. To break free of the gravitational pull of the collective requires courage because it means walking a lonely road. It means standing by truths that others deny, honoring insights that others ridicule, and holding two symbols and images that arise from the unconscious, even when they do not fit neatly into the frameworks of conventional thought. This courage is not about proving oneself superior or rebellious. It is about maintaining integrity when everything around seems to demand compromise. The courage required for transformation is first and foremost the courage to face oneself. Jung emphasized that the unconscious contains not only archetypes of wisdom and wholeness, but also the shadow, the repressed, denied aspects of the self that the ego would rather avoid. To embark on individuation is to confront this shadow, to acknowledge impulses, desires, and fears that clash with the ego's self. This confrontation can be terrifying, for it destabilizes the identity one has carefully constructed. Yet without courage, the shadow remains unacknowledged, and the individual remains fragmented. Facing the shadow requires admitting uncomfortable truths, integrating what has been denied, and carrying the burden of this newfound wholeness into daily life. This is not the work of the faint-hearted, for it demands vulnerability, honesty, and a willingness to suffer the discomfort of seeing oneself without illusions. Courage is also needed to resist the seduction of the collective. The collective unconscious exerts an enormous influence on the individual, offering security and belonging at the cost of authenticity. Myths, customs, and group values are powerful, and they promise to relieve the individual of the anxiety of standing alone. Yet individuation demands that one not simply dissolve into the collective, but stand apart from it, bringing forth one's unique contribution. To resist this pull is to endure the loneliness of being misunderstood, the suspicion of those who see difference as threat, and the fear of isolation that arises when one steps outside the crowd. Courage is the inner strength to withstand these pressures without capitulating, to remain rooted in truth even when the cost is exclusion. The transformative power of courage lies in its capacity to carry an individual through the threshold of fear. Fear is the greatest obstacle to transformation. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of ridicule, fear of one's own unconscious depth, all of these conspire to keep a person bound to the familiar. Yet courage is not the absence of fear, it is the willingness to move forward despite fear. Jung suggested that transformation occurs when one holds the tension of opposites, fear and courage, despair and hope, shadow and light, without collapsing into one side or the other. By standing in this tension with courage, the psyche reorganizes itself at a deeper level, leading to growth and integration. The act of confronting fear itself becomes the catalyst for transformation. There is also the courage to trust the unconscious. Jung believed that the unconscious is not merely a repository of repressed material, but a living, creative force that guides the process of individuation. Dreams, symbols, and synchronicities are expressions of this force, offering guidance and insight, yet trusting these messages often requires going against rational expectation or social convention. It may mean following a path that others consider irrational, or listening to a dream image that challenges one's assumptions. This trust demands courage, for it requires surrendering the ego's illusion of control and allowing oneself to be led by deeper currents. Transformation occurs when one dares to align with these unconscious processes, integrating their wisdom into conscious life even when it feels uncertain or risky. Courage also manifests in the willingness to live authentically. In the outer world, it is one thing to have inner insights, but another to embody them in action, relationships, and work. Authentic living often means breaking with expectations, whether those of family, culture, or peers. It may mean pursuing a vocation that others do not understand, holding values that others reject, or speaking truths that others find uncomfortable. This embodiment of authenticity is perhaps the most visible expression of courage, for it exposes the individual to judgment and rejection. Yet without this outer manifestation, transformation remains incomplete. The inner vision must find expression in the outer world, and only courage can carry it across that threshold. The transformative effect of such courage is profound. By remaining authentic, the individual not only grows inwardly, but also contributes to the evolution of the collective. Jung believed that the health of society depends on the individuation of its members. For only individuals who are authentic can bring new truths into the collective. The courage of one person to stand apart can eventually inspire others, planting seeds of change that transform the culture itself. Many of the great advances in human thought, art, and spirituality began with individuals who had the courage to remain faithful to their vision despite resistance. Their transformation became the catalyst for collective transformation, and their courage created ripples far beyond their own lives. Courage in the Jungian sense is not loud or dramatic. It is often quiet, steady, and enduring. It is the courage to continue the work of self-examination when it becomes painful, to return again and again to the depths of the unconscious, to face dreams that unsettle and symbols that challenge. It is the courage to hold fast to authenticity, even in the mundane choices of daily life, to resist small compromises that erode integrity, to honor truth even in silence. This quiet courage accumulates over time, reshaping the psyche, deepening the soul, and forging a life that reflects the wholeness of the self. At the archetypal level, courage is embodied in the hero's journey. The hero ventures into the unknown, faces trials, confronts monsters, and returns transformed. This mythic pattern reflects the psychological process of individuation, where courage is the force that enables the individual to traverse the perilous path of transformation. The monsters represent fears, shadows, and projections. The trials represent the challenges of living authentically. The return represents the integration of these experiences into a fuller life. Courage is the hero's shield, not because it prevents danger, but because it enables perseverance through danger. Transformation is the fruit of this journey, and without courage, the journey cannot be undertaken. Jung also saw courage as deeply linked to love. To live authentically is not to withdraw into isolation, but to engage with the world from a place of truth. This engagement requires love for oneself, love for others, love for truth. Courage and love are intertwined, for it is love that gives courage its purpose, and courage that gives love its strength. Without love, courage becomes defiance for its own sake. Without courage, love becomes sentimentality, unable to withstand reality. Together, they create the conditions for genuine transformation, where the individual not only becomes whole but also contributes meaningfully to the wholeness of others. The danger of seeing what others do not is that one becomes isolated, rejected, or dismissed. But the gift of courage is that it transforms this danger into a path of growth. It enables the individual to remain faithful to their vision, to endure the trials of individuation, and to embody authenticity even when it is costly. Courage makes possible the integration of shadow, the trust in the unconscious, the embodiment of truth, and the contribution to the collective. It is the thread that holds the entire process of transformation together, weaving fear and hope, shadow and light, rejection and authenticity into a tapestry of wholeness. Without courage, the individual remains trapped in conformity. With courage, they cross the threshold into transformation.